I was going to ask if you can hear me okay, but I can hear me okay, so hey. As Megan mentioned, I work at Salesforce, and I'm super excited to be in Perth. It's my first time in Perth, so thank you for having me. I also think quokkas are really rad, and we got to see the quokkas this week, so thank you so much for that as well. Yeah, so I do work on the Lightning design system, and we'll be talking a little bit about process and design systems, but a little bit more about me. As Megan mentioned, I do run a design systems conference called Clarity. So if you're in San Francisco at the end of March, please come. And of course, my front-end meetup called the Mixin, total coincidental. And I wanted to mention my Slack because maybe you can jump in right now and do some chatting about design system stuff. So if you go to designsystems.herokuapp.com, that's my design system Slack. So yeah, so super excited to be here, especially because I got a Kangaskhan on my first Pokemon Go try. Yeah, that was pretty exciting. But I'm here to talk about design systems. I love design systems. A lot of people seem to love design systems. There's a whole bunch of content out on the internet about design systems. You got people like Andy talking about art directing design systems. But yeah, so styleguides.io, lots of content there. The whole point of design systems and the reason that we have them is all about quality. So what is a design system? Yeah. Well, design systems are not new. You know, as I mentioned, I do have a design systems conference, and the keynote speaker that I had was Richard Daney, who is 84 years old, and he worked on the design system for NASA back in the 70s. So these things have been around for a very long time. The way that we kind of talk about them now today is a little different. Usually they're talked about in the context of products, and so they're a little bit more complex. I'm going to kind of talk about a really complex one that I work on. But basically the point is design systems can really be all sorts of different things. Some people know them as brand guidelines. As I mentioned, NASA, back in the 70s, they were doing brand design guidelines in print, these massive binders with how design systems work across everything from uniforms to space shuttles. In fact, this is actually in the public domain now, so you can totally get the PDF if you want to nerd out about this. They also had a really cool Kickstarter where you could get a really beautifully bound version of it. But if you didn't get that, do check out that. But it's really cool to look at because it shows how far that we've come when it comes to design systems. Again, these were done in print. In fact, these were all done with no computers. Everything was done by hand. Had to cut and paste everything, including the letter forms. And now you go to today, and you've got these online design systems. And in some case, they might just be a page of brand guidelines. This is an example of Dropbox's branding guidelines. And I like these because you can download the assets. But these kind of are, this is a little bit more about like how the logo is used and the spacing and all that. What a lot of companies are moving more towards is more of a design language. And a design language is a little bit of a step up from brand guidelines. They're not just about logo usage, spacing. They're a little bit more of like an approach or a philosophy. Kind of like the gut feeling that you get when you think about that product or that company. So some examples that are out right now, you know, material design is a very well-known example, and it's all about that material, tactile feel, the way it looks and feels, the shadows, the motion. It all implies that it's tactile. You got companies like Uber that are doing their brand guidelines as more of a design language or a philosophy. It tells you like what their personality of their company is. And then on a very parallel track to brand is voice and tone. this is kind of a little bit about like the personality of your organization or your product in writing. MailChimp is super well known for this. They have voiceandtone.com, and these guidelines are really, really well thought out. The way you come across when there's an error versus if you have a success message, you're going to want to sound a little bit different. And I thought it was pretty cool that Alice mentioned this post earlier from Slack called Words Are Hard, which she illustrated. I had no idea she actually did this illustration, so it's really cool. But this is basically a post Slack wrote about their approach to voice and tone and the personality that comes across. And if you use Slack, it feels very friendly and it feels like fun to use. And a big part of that is how much time and attention that they put into their voice and tone. Pattern libraries or UI libraries. These are kind of what people are talking about. Component libraries, front-end style guides, whatever you want to call it. These are kind of like now, I guess, when people are thinking about design systems and style guides, it's usually in the context now of a pattern library. And there are some really great examples out there. I love the work that 18F is doing. They work on the design system for the United States of America. And so the idea was that a lot of sites that are from the US government are kind of all over the place, and you don't know if you can trust it. And this organization is working on creating standards and resources and tools so that all these different government websites can have a very trusted and a very well-crafted site. And the thing I love about the design system that 18F does is they put a lot of thought into the documentation. So they show like components that are accessible, any sort of JavaScript requirements, all the different states, variations. It's just really, really well documented. So like, which one am I talking about? Well, design systems really can be any of these things that I mentioned, or it could be all of them. It could be just other things as well. It's really more about what your organization needs. So what you might call a design system may be more complex or less complex than what I think of when I think of a design system. But the point is that it's more about what your organization needs. It's about communication. I think it's really important to not think about design systems as a side project. That's where you can fall into some issues. A design system is not a side project. And if you're applying a design system to your current product workflow, this will become how you ship product. So threw around a lot of terminology like style guides, design systems. And this question gets asked a lot. Jared Spool was interviewing Nathan Curtis in a podcast, and if you're not familiar with who Nathan Curtis is, he's one of the most vocal people in the industry about design systems. And in this interview, Jared was asking Nathan, got style guides, now it's design systems. Is it just a change in the marketing, or are these things actually different from one another? And yeah, it was a very good question, and this question is asked by many people. And I liked Nathan's approach to how he defined it, how it applies to his work. And what he said was that a style guide is an artifact of design process, whereas a design system is a living funded product with a roadmap, a backlog, and serving an ecosystem. So that's kind of how I kind of think about design systems in the context of the work that I do. I do work at a very large company. We have 20,000 employees, last I heard, and we have so many different products. I feel like almost every week we're acquiring a new company. So we have a lot of products in our ecosystem, and I've learned that product design in an enterprise organization such as Salesforce can be really tricky. Because you're not just thinking about, in my world, I'm not just thinking about one product, I'm thinking about an entire ecosystem. And to be able to ship great products when you're having to think about an entire ecosystem, you have to have great communication. Great team communication is so critical. How many times have we had those repetitive conversations, you know, like, hey, where can I find the icons? What color is the button border? Where can I find the icons? Like, yeah, it could be pretty amusing, and I was trying so hard not to laugh, but the way a lot of companies have approached this is red lines. And red lines are basically where you spec a design out to very full detail, your spacing, your sizing, your fonts, all of that. But as you can imagine, on an enterprise scale, like when you have a lot of different features and products and screens, it's not very fun. Like, I remember I was working with a designer that wanted me to spec out what we call record home, and if you've used our product at all, like, it's basically lots and lots of records, and we were supposed to be speccing these all these records out, and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. that was really bad, wasn't it? But red lines promote designing pages, and it's not about designing pages, is it? It's about designing systems. There's this really great article that Diana Mounter was writing. She's the design systems lead at GitHub, and she talks a lot about empowering designers to code. And she said that true collaboration isn't throwing designs over the wall. It's designers, engineers, and the rest of the team sharing the responsibility to build a quality product. And I think that's really important, the word sharing the responsibility, because that's what this is all about, like working together, collaborating, and that communication. So say you're approaching this in your own organization. You got to figure out who's going to work on it, right? There's this really fantastic post Nathan wrote called Team Models for Scaling a Design System. And basically, he talks about the 3 models that he's observed in the companies that he's worked with. And I think the first approach is, he described it as sort of kind of more like the bootstrap model, where you have a solitary model. You might have like one team member or a very small team that they make the system, but it's really about that team's needs, and then you can use it or not use it. It's kind of up to you. And then what a lot of companies are moving toward is a centralized model. And this is where you have a central design team, and their day-to-day job is to support and maintain that design system. And that's supported and then used by the rest of the organization. And then the other model that he talks about is what's known as federated. And this is where you get designers and developers and researchers and whoever from multiple different product teams, which is definitely the case if you're in a much larger organization, and they all collaborate and work on that design system together. And you know, any of these approaches could be right for your organization depending on team size, how you work together, whether or not your people are working on this full-time or on the side. But in terms of how we do it, Nathan asked at the end of the blog post, how do other people do it? So I wrote the little follow-up post on Medium, because that's kind of what you do on Medium. And I wrote about the Salesforce team model for scaling a design system. But I wasn't really introducing a brand new model by any means. It was really just a merging of the second and the third model. And I called it cyclical, as we're large enough that we can have a cyclical model where we have a centralized design systems team. That's what I'm on. We act as like a librarian, distributor, facilitator, and we maintain the design system. We make sure it's crafted with quality. But then we have all the federated contributors too, because they're the ones that actually know their space very well. They know their feature. They've done the research, they've been in the trenches, and they're who actually help keep the design system accurate and current and actually useful. And so it kind of becomes this pairing model where our design system helps inform the product design that they do, but then their product design is in turn informing the design system that we work on. So it's this very collaborative pairing model. That might be a bit larger than what your organization can handle, and that's okay. I think the point is you definitely want to like figure out like who are the team members that are going to work on this. And as I mentioned, design systems is a product. Product design requires research. And when we started out, we did a lot of talking to people. We talked to designers, we talked to engineers, we talked to stakeholders, the people building it, the people using it. And actually, like earlier this week, we went through this process in the design systems workshop. It was written up by Adobe, but Adobe didn't create this process. This was actually a presentation I guess, notes from a presentation given by Isaac Hayes and Donna Chan, who work at AppDirect. And this was how they made sure that their design system was actually created with an actual plan in place and formed on real research. And this, I really liked this presentation because it aligns so close to how we did it too. Like we did the same thing. The way we interviewed people, and then we kind of took all the different things that we got from the interview and narrowed those down to like principles, and then from there, like creating our priorities. So if you want to kind of go through this process, I highly recommend going through this post. The point is that you need to have a clear vision to align efforts. And I think doing that research is so important. So many people just kind of jump right into creating a design system, but they have no objectives, they have no vision, they have no metrics that they want to meet, and it ends up failing. You have to have a purpose for it. God, I'm really bad at not laughing. My former mentor, friend-tor, if you will, he was the chief design architect at Salesforce. Now he's the VP of product experience at AppDynamics. But one of the things that he would always say was that the more decisions you put off and the longer you delay them, the more expensive they become. And I think that is so true. You have to come to a decision and come to your design decisions as quickly as possible. And in order to do that, or the reason you want to do that is so that you can bring your designers and your developers and your product managers and like everyone else that's involved, that they're all aligned around a single goal. Saw this really great comic by XKCD, and it says how standards proliferate. And it's like, situation, there are 14 competing standards. 14? Ridiculous. We need to develop one universal standard that covers everyone's use cases. Yeah, situation, there are 15 competing standards. Like this happens so much, and it's because that their decision making didn't go so well, and it's because they didn't drive their design decisions through principles. And that's the important thing that I think you have to figure out as early on as possible. What are your design principles? And by having your design principles, you will be able to come to better design decisions as quickly as possible. So these design principles that you're going to come up with should emerge from that research that you've done, the people that you've talked to, when words like efficiency or maintainability or all these words that might come up a lot when you're talking to your users, builders, stakeholders, those are the things that you want to take note of and come up to like what your design principles are. So actually, this is mine. I'm going to share the ones that we have at Salesforce. But the cool thing that I've found is that, so I've done like design systems workshops a couple times, and these tend to be the same words almost everybody seems to come up with. So it's kind of cool to see that. It's sort of validating. But the ones that we came up with, so number one is clarity. And I actually named my conference Clarity 2 years before I actually found out that we had like these design principles. So that was kind of cool. But yeah, clarity is number one for us. We want to eliminate ambiguity, enable people to see, understand, and act with confidence. The second one being efficiency. Streamline and optimize workflows, intelligently anticipate needs to help people work better, smarter, and faster. The third one is consistency. Through consistency, we can create familiarity, strengthen intuition by applying the same solution to the same problem. And fourth is beauty. Through beauty, we can demonstrate respect for people's time and attention through thoughtful and elegant craftsmanship. Now that order that I gave them to you is important. Anytime you come up with a list of principles, you want to put them in a priority order. And I thought it was cool, like when Joel was talking about the prioritization, it's really important to figure out what that order is, kind of like an order of operations, because this is going to help be what will get you to a design decision much faster. So clarity was number one because clarity is core to our experience. We want our users to have clarity of how to complete their tasks or reach their goals. And then through this is how we will gain their trust. And then efficiency almost was number one for us, but as we were talking to our users, we realized like we can really like double down on efficiency, but we might alienate brand new users. So we needed to make sure that clarity for new users was as solid as possible, and then help them be more efficient. Because when you make mistakes, mistakes are costly. So this was the order that made sense for us. And then usually, like when I talk to people about design systems, consistency is usually talked about as the number one goal. But for us, we felt that sometimes something might be different, and you might argue, like, why should we call this collaborate instead of feed, or everywhere else we call it feed? Well, in this particular context, collaborate is going to be a lot more clear to the user of what you're doing in that space. So sometimes you're going to have those debates that come up, and people aren't going to agree, and by having this order of operations in place, you can sort of stack rank and be like, okay, it might be consistent, but by making this change, it'll be more efficient and have better clarity. So that becomes your metric of how to make design decisions. And then, of course, beauty. Beauty is important to us as designers, but it's not our defining purpose for our product. So that's the order that works for us. You might come up with different principles. You might come up with different or a different order, and that's totally fine. But I think it's important to have these. And in design systems, people talk so much about design standards, and design standards are so important. But your design principles are so much more important than design standards. And then in order to really make these successful, you'll need to evangelize and align people on these principles. So the artwork that was on my slides, these became postcards and they became posters, and we put these things all up over the office. And so as people are having those design debates and trying to come to decisions, they can be reminded of our principles and what order they are in. I wanted to mention something else that we do in our organization to get alignment. Some companies use this approach, and then some have their own approach that is pretty similar. And it's what we call the V2 MOM. And this is written about by our CEO on our blog. You can read it later. But basically, the gist of it is this is something that we publish. Every single person in the company publishes their V2 MOM every year on their profile. And it starts from the top with the CEO, then the execs, and then the managers, and then the individual contributors. And we create sort of this alignment. So V meaning vision, what do you want to do? The values, what's important about that vision, How are you going to get the job done? That's your methods. And then, of course, you're going to have some challenges and problems that might stand in the way. These are your obstacles. And then finally, your measures or your metrics. Like, how are you going to actually know that you've succeeded? Without having this, there's so many things that can go wrong. That one was not quite delivered as well as I was hoping, but there's so many things that can go wrong. Yeah, so you need to have that vision in place. So next up, you've got your vision, you've got your values, you've got your metrics, and a UI inventory. I think this is a really fun exercise to do. You can either do this through printing it out and cutting it out, and this was written about by Charlotte Jackson on Instapart. And you'll get screens like this where you can assemble these things together. You got like status indicators or tabs or navigation, and you just sort of look for all the unique instances of these components in your UI. And this actually will bring about a lot of open questions, and you'll see a lot of inconsistencies. You could also kind of like sketch things out too if you're sort of more starting out. Brad Frost actually released a Google deck that you can use if you want to do it digitally through screenshots. It's a little quicker and easier and saves paper. But the idea being that you inventory all these different components, all the states, all the variations, and then through that, you standardize and consolidate. And you're always going to find like components that exist that probably either don't need to exist, or like maybe it's a variant that doesn't really need to exist. So this can be really great for identifying that and consolidating. And it's really important to take lots and lots of notes when you're doing this process. So things like keyboard navigation or accessibility requirements, any sort of like visual differentiation states, even like the people that are involved, like who's the lead dev, who's the lead designer, who's the product owner. And then going into like the details of things like accessibility requirements, it's really important to think through these things. For us, accessibility is a mandate. Like we have a lot of government clients, and in the US, it's the law. Like if you have government clients, you have to be accessible. So as we're documenting, going through these components that we've inventoried, we're looking at, what kind of keyboard navigation is required. Are we using color appropriately? All the things that are around accessibility. And it's important to think about this as early as possible. Cordelia McGee-Tubb works at Dropbox. She's their accessibility engineer. And she uses the metaphor of a blueberry muffin that I really like a lot. In fact, it's unfortunately been misquoted to me. It's not my quote, it's Cordelia's quote. She's super rad. But the idea being you want to bake those blueberries in from the beginning. You don't want to cram them in later, because then that's kind of a really crappy muffin. So that's how you should treat accessibility. So as you're working on your design system and thinking through your different patterns, it's really important to think about accessibility at the beginning and not shoehorning it in later. And you're also going to have things around localization and internationalization. Things like text expansion is probably the most thought about thing when it comes to this. There's also capitalization, like button labels tend to be capitalized in the US, but in some Spanish languages, you would actually only capitalize the first word. So things like that to consider. Color meaning, in the US, red is negative usually. So if the stocks are falling, we're usually going to use red. However, some stock apps in China would actually use red as a positive color because it indicates fortune. So it's really important to think through these types of consideration. And document all of this. Everything that you find, document it. Miriam Suzanne says if you don't document something, it doesn't exist. And it's so true. If you don't document, it's not going to happen. Like you might see like, oh, we need to think about this keyboard navigation concern, but you don't write it down, you don't get it in some sort of written format, then you're never really going to address it. You have to document it. I actually just saw a post by Jina go all over my Twitter stream yesterday because it was like retweeted. And I really liked what she had to say about documentation. It's paramount because that is the deliverable of a component library. So yeah, document. It's part of it. So as you're going through this exercise, there's going to be things that are going to come up, like special snowflakes. That's what we like to call them. These are the things that don't really seem like they belong anywhere, or might be like a very unique instance of something. And that's totally fine. I think a lot of people assume, like with design systems, everything has to be super consistent and utilitarian, and you can't allow for any deviation or any changes, and that's not really true. Design systems are there to help you be more efficient and faster, but it's totally fine to have like different special snowflakes. But you should question them, especially if it's a component or a UI pattern. But if it's something like a homepage design or like something seasonal, these things are going to happen, and that's totally fine. The idea for all of this is communication. It's about empowering your designers and your developers. You know, for us, we try really hard to get our designers comfortable with code, but sometimes that's not going to happen. So other ways to give them resources and tools is documentation, UI kits, things like that. And then for our developers, we want to empower them by giving them very scalable and accessible code at the beginning. So we've done our inventory based on we've also done our research, we've got our principles. Now when it comes to actually documenting, what are the things that you want to write down? I think almost every style guide that you see, you always see these beautiful little color swatches, and these are great. I like looking at them, they're very aesthetically pleasing. But when you're writing style guide documentation, it's really important to be meaningful, and that's what's going to make it actually useful. So yeah, you have your nice little color swatches, but how do you actually use color, and how do you apply it? What are the rules that you have around color? So how to use color to indicate visual messaging, or how to use it to indicate hierarchy. And I have a wallaby, but I don't remember what my pun was. So, yeah, okay. Okay. Moving on. Wallaby next. Sorry, there we go. Anyway, yeah, so in the world of design systems for product design, especially in today's product design, we got a lot of platforms and we got a lot of devices to think through. And for us, this is a really huge problem because not only are we thinking through all the different devices and all the different platforms, but we also have different products, and then sometimes it might be a different use case. So for most of our products, we have nice white space, but some of our products might need something a little different because they're a customer service agent and they need to see as much content on the page as possible, so they get a more condensed layout. So how do we actually deal with this? Well, I'll tell you how we do it. And this is really important to us because we do get a lot of these questions from not just our internal team, but also we have a lot of developers on our platform that build apps that basically get put inside Salesforce. So they want their stuff to look like us. So how do we scale our visual design across all these different considerations? And we don't want our UI to be stagnant. We want to make changes, and we want to make visual design updates. So how do we achieve this faster? And as I mentioned, we do have developers on our platform. They might be using our own Lightning platform, or they might be using Rails, or they might be using iOS technology, they might be using Java, like they could be using all sorts of different stacks. And even within Salesforce internally, we have people on all sorts of stacks, especially when it comes to the different devices and platforms. So how do we keep our design system agnostic? And the way that we do that is through design tokens. And design tokens are essentially how we apply our design decisions with confidence. And the way that this sort of came about, so for our style guide years ago when we were working on Salesforce One, which is our mobile app, we actually maintained a sketch sheet with a visual representation of all the SAS variables that we were using. And this is how we maintained it on our team at that time. And this was sort of the genesis of what design tokens ended up becoming. So we were using these as SAS variables. The engineering team were using these as what were known as tokens, but they're basically little strings that they could use in the code base, because Lightning was built on like Java and XML and all this stuff. So it was a little bit of a different format. But what this ended up becoming was our single source of truth. The VP of UX engineering, who was one of the early people working on the earlier style guide work we were doing before the Lightning design system launch, he said that design tokens are an abstraction for everything impacting the visual design of an app or platform. So this evolved over time to being maintained by our team through an actual format that was not just a sketch file. What we ended up having was a JSON file in a repository, and these were all of our visual elements like color, spacing, sizing, like pretty much even animation durations, like anything that would go behind the colon in CSS that could be stored as a token. We maintained it on our team, and then we open sourced a tool called Theo. And Theo would basically take that JSON file, or YAML if you prefer, and generate the XML strings that you would need for Lightning, variables for SAS, less, and stylus, because while we use SAS, we have a few other teams that actually prefer less or stylus instead. And then this actually gave us a platform for native as well. So we were generating XML for Android, JSON for iOS. We were generating color swatches for designers off of it. Like it kind of really became this very robust infrastructure. And it was great because historically, if a test failed and said, hey, this text color is not contrasted enough with the background color, you have to fix it, and that's important to us. You used to have to notify the Android team and the iOS team, and like for us being such a large organization, like these are very distinct, separate teams, and then all the other like web teams and so on. But now, like we can change it on our end because we maintain all of that in one central repository, and then when they run a build, they get the new values, and they don't really even have to do anything. So it's been really great. And what's really cool is, like, this isn't just us doing this. A lot of companies are doing this either through design tokens, like what we have, or they might be calling it something else. Like I think Facebook calls theirs constants, and I can't think of all of them right now, but like a lot of companies are basically doing this right now. I saw this post that Nathan wrote recently of how he approaches design tokens in his design systems, and it's worth a read because he also talks a little bit about naming conventions. Like we have our own naming conventions, but it's a pretty interesting read. This is not like a totally brand new concept. I mean, SAS has had CSS, like CSS preprocessors basically introduced this concept years ago, and it was all about achieving consistency and maintainability in your CSS. But is that me? But the idea of it and having that workflow in place is moving people away from having hard-coded values. So for designers, when they're speccing a design, if they're not working in code and they're speccing a design, rather than speccing something to be 16 pixels, they would spec something to be spacing medium. And as far as they're concerned, they're speaking the same language with the developer, and you might have a different way of defining 16 pixels in Android or iOS, and that's fine. Like, we do that through our build process. So instead of thinking about all the dimensions and the color formats, they can just say, use spacing medium, or use font size medium, or whatever it is that they're speccing. So yeah, so for us, as I mentioned, our design tokens are converted to all the different formats that we need. This has been really great for us, but we found like it wasn't just about maintainability, and it wasn't just about being able to deploy changes faster. We found that it actually gave us an infrastructure to do some other really cool things. So this is a feature that's not out, so don't take pictures, but we're looking at things like, as I mentioned before, some of our customers need to have a more condensed layout, and then some of our customers want a more white space layout. And this is pretty similar to how Gmail has the cozy, compact, comfortable. And doing this manually would have been pretty hard across all these different screens. So we're looking at how we can have certain design tokens configurable so that we can do things like apply spacing changes. Other things like the concept of night mode, which is not out yet either, but this is the top rated thing in our idea exchange that our customers give us feedback in. Like, they're all asking for a night mode because some people are staring at these screens all day from their job, and it's kind of hard on their eyes. And so they're wanting a more, a more toned down look of our UI. And again, through defining certain tokens to be configurable, we can look at how we can apply these type of features for our customers. So we get a lot of cool side benefits. All the stuff I'm talking about, our design system, Theo, it is open source. So if you want to check it out, please feel free to do that. And it'll help you become quicker? I don't know. That one was the worst, I promise. One thing I want to iterate very strongly is that there is no product too large or too small. I'm telling you how we do it, and it seems pretty complex and pretty big because we have a very big and complex problem. You might not need the level of abstraction that I'm talking about here, and that's fine. But the idea being to have that design system in place so that you can scale gracefully and efficiently. These concepts can be used by anyone. There was this post where Brad Frost was writing about responsive design, but I think it applies pretty well to really any sort of workflow, like design systems or whatever you're focusing on. He was talking about how people will say, like, well, I'm just a small company, I'm not BBC, or I'm not Salesforce, so why would I need to do all this? And he was saying, the name of his post was "It Doesn't Matter." And he was saying, just because something might seem like it's hard, it doesn't mean that it's not worth pursuing. It is our job to solve those problems. Like, that's our business. We're in the interface business. And I thought this was really important to mention because, you might not need a design system to the scale of what I'm talking about, but if you treat it as part of your workflow, part of your process, like how you ship product, it's going to help you scale and be maintainable, and it's totally worth the investment. And then it's important to keep that momentum going. I think what I see a lot is people put their style guides online, and they're super proud of it, and then it just kind of sits there, and it dies, and it rots, and it eats your brains. And it's because nobody's really like taking care of them. They're not treating it like a living product. It's more of like that side project that I mentioned before. And we don't want to create a zombie style guide, or we could say something a little scarier than zombies, maybe a drop bear? No. The idea is that it must be living. It's got to be living. And one thing I want to iterate as well is that, remember, design systems are a product. A product requires good support. It's how, like, the products that you know and love usually have an amazing support team. And so if you're treating this as a product, the only way it's going to succeed is to support it. And so for us, you know, we have a lot of people that have to adopt this. And so we're doing brown bag luncheons. We're doing, we do what we call an advisory board, where people can come and talk with the whole team about what they're working on. If you're a smaller organization, maybe you want to do something more like office hours, even a Slack channel. If you're using something like Yammer or Chatter, you can have like a group on there. But the idea being having a place where people can get support and help that they need. And then one of the final things that I want to mention is that a good design system that's living, I think, needs to allow for evolution and iteration. Claudina Sarai said that patterns are not dogma, they can change and adapt. So it's, when you have this design system in place and you have maybe your like really well-built pattern library or all your documentation, if you get too rigid where like we cannot deviate from this whatsoever, we have to only do what is in this design system, you're going to basically have a really boring product. It's okay to allow things to iterate and change and evolve. That's where the innovation is going to happen. And you know, as Andy mentioned this morning, I love this picture of him. Art direction is the gravity that pulls the atoms together. So don't look at it as something that's a constraint that will keep you from being creative. I think a design system enables you to have more time and a much bigger space to be creative. Thanks, that's it.